So let's jump into the actual stuff. What are we covering in this stream? So in this stream, we're going to be covering some topics. Obviously, feel free to ask questions as we go along, because my goal here is to be able to connect you with other people, with myself, to be able to help you get the best you can do on your test, on your quiz, just APUSH in general, and then, of course, preparing you for that exam in May. So 1920s technology is going to be our first topic. We got 1920s culture. We got the Great Depression that happens in the 1930s. The New Deal that also happens in the 1930s, and then we're going to have a special little bonus section on the interwar foreign policy, aka between World War I and World War II, what does the United States foreign policy look like? And then we'll wrap up with some questions and answers at the very end. Again, feel free to ask questions throughout. I have some practice questions embedded in each of these sections. So as we go through, I'll ask for some answers, and then we'll look at some samples as well. So if you have your answers, put those in the chat, and that'll be helpful because then we can sort of bounce off of that. The more interactive this is, the better it works for me and the better it works for everyone else, frankly, too. So let's just jump right on in. 1920s technology. The 1920s is a time sometimes called the Jazz Age, sometimes called the Roaring Twenties. We need to be careful with those kind of labels, of course, because we need to ask, well, is jazz the most important thing about the 1920s? Is music the most important? The Roaring Twenties, the economy was doing really well, but really well for whom? Right? So we got to be careful about those labels, but for sure, having the idea of the 1920s as an economically prosperous time for some Americans, as long as we can leave that caveat in there, that'd be helpful. It's a prosperous time for some Americans, and a lot of that is thanks to new technologies. So a couple examples, you can probably see those in the pictures already. If you think you know what those are, I'd go ahead and throw those in the chat. We need to talk about some 1920s technology, and I always like throwing out some bonus points. Virtual bonus points that are basically meaningless, but hey, they help you and get you bragging rights. Anyone know what either of those two inventions are? The black and white one is obviously from the time period. The color one is a modern version. Ella's got the second one. Yeah, that's a Model T car. Yep. Obviously one that's still around and thus able to be captured in all of its full color glory. Remember, Henry Ford once famously said, you can have it in any color you want as long as it's black. And then the upper right-hand corner, that picture is a little bit odd. We don't necessarily listen to this invention the same way that we did back then. That is a radio where everyone needed their own individual earphone in order to hear it. Speakers hadn't quite caught up to what they were going to be a little bit later. So let's talk about some of those things. A lot of household technology appears in the 1920s. The 1920s is a period of rapid transition, rapid change. It's after World War I. Consumer spending goes up. People are no longer rationed. And so spending on newfangled devices like vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, radios, etc. Radios are the ones that are depicted in the image there. Angela, yes, the cotton gin. That would probably still be a thing, yeah. It's invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney, but they're probably still using it down south, right? I feel like we can always just cram in cotton gin no matter where we are in APUSH, although, obviously keep it in time period, right? Vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, we're starting to get more high tech, yeah? And a lot of these have to do with domestic household appliances. Now, this is going to transform the lives of women somewhat. Allegedly, there's going to be more leisure time. We'll talk about that a little bit later. There's the Model T. Cars become somewhat affordable for your middle-class Americans. That's going to be important. Advertising starts to change. The 1920s is when you start to see directed psychological advertising. They even start to invent problems that they can then solve with their own products. So you see companies like Listerine warning you about the dangers of bad breath or halitosis. Americans didn't care about bad breath before the 1920s, but they hired these psychologists to say, okay, how can make people feel self-conscious about something and then sell them something to be able to solve that problem? One of the reasons things like these are, like advertisements are even successful is because there is now a national mass market. Radios mean that everyone with a radio, within reason, is largely listening to the same ads, the same shows. You get popular sports teams, celebrities that we'll talk about in a little bit. So we start to get this national culture related to radios. There's also movies that begin to be shown more often in the 1920s, but radio is certainly a big deal. You also get this idea, though, of buying on credit. My favorite analogy for the 1920s is a Jenga tower. The 1920s goes way, way, way up. The stock market's increasing. It's going really well. The problem is it's an unstable foundation. If you've ever played Jenga, it's with those triple blocks that you go in alternating rows. And the idea here is that you're taking away them from the bottom, and then you put them on top and you're done. And it makes it go up, 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 up. But there's a certain limit to how far it can go before the bottom collapses because it's unstable. And that's how the economy was in the 1920s. Credit, like a credit card, refers to borrowing money to buy things you cannot afford. So if people are buying, ooh, there's a good pun to be made there. Model Ts, afford, get it? If people can't afford radios, but their neighbors have them, they want to take out some money, maybe buy it on layaway, installment plans, taking out credit. You start to see some of the first diners credit cards emerging. And we also see people buying stocks using credit, which is called buying on the margin. And borrowing money to buy stocks works really well as long as the stocks keep going up. And spoiler alert, they don't go up forever. 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression. So that's going to really hurt a lot of people. So the 1920s is a boom time for a lot of people that own stocks, for a lot of the rich people. The problem is it's not necessarily built on a solid foundation. Plus, if you're a farmer, you know, of course, the 1920s, the Great Depression begins early. It does not go well. Some more technology and some of the effects of technology. We mentioned some of these gentlemen. So there's a national culture. There's some celebrity. So we start to see people like Babe Ruth. We see other sports celebrities as you're able to listen to these things on the radio. You can see Babe Ruth is a big deal. The other guy who's playing the spirit of St. Louis, that's Charles Lindbergh. And so he becomes a famous flyer for his exploits, the first man to fly across the Atlantic Ocean by himself in an airplane. But then you also have this dark downside to culture spreading. There's a lot of regional culture that starts to spread, and some of that is going to come from the Jim Crow South. And the best example that I can think of that you should be somewhat aware of is The Birth of a Nation. This is the D.W. Griffith silent film. It's the most successful silent film of all time. It was shown in 1915. It's when it came out. But it began to spread during this post-war time period, and the ideas of it, where the KKK was meant to be the hero of Reconstruction, as you APUSHers know, terrible history, obviously. But this kind of movie is a good example. It's indicative. It showcases the Jim Crow segregation and the racism that's going to happen in the 1920s that starts to spread partly thanks to new 1920s technology. So we've covered some 1920s technology. Let's take a look at a practice short answer question. So here's one example that you could maybe see on the test someday. Briefly describe how one specific technology changed American society between 1919 and 1929. If you think you have an answer, go ahead and throw that into the chat over on the right-hand side. I want to give you some examples of things that I thought could be potentially useful for us, and show you how you can improve some of your short answer questions. If you're throwing it into the chat, you obviously don't need to explain the whole thing or write incomplete sentences. You can just drop some vocab there real quick. Radio increased advertising, spreading ideas easily. Thanks, Ella. That sounds great. Yeah, there's a variety of ways you can do this, right? The Model T car means that more Americans can start traveling further. Automobiles change the lifestyle. Mafuz is talking about it. Excellent, excellent. Because now it's available to everybody. Yeah. Now, I'm being super picky just because you're super intelligent, Mafuz. Remember, everybody? There are probably some people that still can't afford cars, but much more widely available. Yes? Absolutely. Absolutely. So cars change. There are some downsides, as we'll talk about later in the 1920s. Telephones, those are starting to be more of a thing. Absolutely. Thanks, Angeli. And we also have cars changing culture in terms of how people date. Unfortunately, there is a connection between automobiles and teenage pregnancy, as teens are able to use cars to get away and go to lovers' lanes and date in that sort of way. It's no longer in front of the parents and sit down in the parlor type stuff. So there is some sketchy behavior going on there. We'll talk about the women's liberation, the birth control of flappers, the music, and all that kind of stuff. The sexual liberation that comes from the 20s is a part of this as well. We'll get there. We have other examples. Thanks for your contributions, folks. Here's one that I chose. I said we could talk about, well, how about the radio or the vacuum? Household appliances. The vacuum changed how Americans worked at home. Well, that would be a good start, right? But you folks have probably heard of ACE before, the answer site Explain. And Angela, you could absolutely use pop-up toasters. Oh man, toasters are great. Used one this morning. This would be a good start to an answer, right? The vacuum changed how Americans worked at home. It's good, but it could be improved upon. You could say the vacuum changed how chores were done at home since it cleaned faster. It led to less housework. Sometimes it works well. Yeah, Mafuz, if you're like mixing up the ACE and you explain before you cite, that doesn't really matter. As long as it's somewhere in your answer and you're telling us why we should care, I think it really works. So yeah, it's not a hard and fast sort of rule. I think you do a good job of that probably. And again, this is not to show that like always longer is better in terms of your answers, but it does show the importance of explaining yourself. So here's my final answer, and this is debatable, but it's certainly a claim you could make, and it certainly would be a viable answer. Household appliances changed the domestic lives of some women. Inventions like the vacuum made household cleaning chores easier to accomplish, creating more leisure time for women. That is debatable. A lot of it comes down to, well, do you just replace one chore with another one? Well, now you're spending less time with keeping your floors clean because you have a vacuum cleaner, but you're now doing other chores more often. It's debatable, but either way, that is a legitimate claim you could make for the short answer question, and that would be a good way of making it specific to women, American society. How are women's lives changing? More leisure because of the vacuum cleaner that made household cleaning chores easier. So it's explaining what the vacuum does. You don't have to give a technical definition of exactly what a vacuum is and how it works and all that stuff, but it would be handy to be able to know that the vacuum is a household cleaning appliance and not just something I've heard of and I don't know what it is, but I'm going to use it. So that would be one example. So 1920s, a time of new culture, a time of new technology, and the two are intertwined. Let's dive more into the 1920s culture. So one of the most important things that happens during the 1920s is urbanization. Now, this process has obviously been going on for a while. We talked about this in the previous couple of units with the Gilded Age, people moving into cities. Urbanization is occurring in previous sections before, but urbanization has continued, and the 1920 census, the census that occurs every 10 years in the United States by law, which is occurring again this year, 2020, urbanization has happened so much that by the 1920 census, the United States is now officially more than half urban. It's now more than 50% of people living in cities and less than 50% of people are living in rural areas. So cities are growing. Now, that's going to be really important because during the 1920s and some of the other cultural controversies we're going to talk about, there is a large rural-urban divide. City folk look down on rural folk look down on city folk. And that's for reasons you could probably imagine. Cities tend to be the places where immigrants come. It tends to be the areas of more new ideas, where not everyone knows you and is in everyone's business, and so you can be a bit more anonymous. Therefore, you can be a bit naughtier. Therefore, there's more experimentation, there's more change, there's more diversity, and some of that is scary to people that say, hey, we got a good thing going. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's not change so much. Urbanization also is going to be a result of the Great Migration, which we can talk about. So immigration, migration, African Americans moving up from the South. You can actually see that over here in this map. You got African Americans coming from the down South, and they're fleeing Jim Crow racial violence, moving up north to urban areas like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and most famously the Harlem section of New York. We'll talk about the Harlem Renaissance in a little bit. So cities continue to grow. A lot of these immigrants are from Southern and Eastern Europe. So a lot of the previous immigration that we saw from the English Isles, from Ireland, from Germany, from Scandinavia, that's starting to shift a little bit. We're starting to see a lot of Polish people, Russian people, Italians, Greeks that are coming to the United States for a variety of reasons that you might study in AP European history someday. And these people are bringing with them new ideas, new cultures, and of course, since it's the United States and it's APUSH, you know that this is going to result in some nativist backlash that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then 1920s culture is also going to involve the Great Migration. We already mentioned that, but that leads to the Harlem Renaissance. And so the Harlem Renaissance, you're going to see Louis Armstrong. You're going to see people creating new kinds of art and culture in Harlem, New York, that connects African Americans both with their African roots and heritage, and also with their heritage and culture as Americans. So there's a lot of great poetry. You're talking your Langston Hughes, your Paul Robeson, your Zora Neale Hurston, your Louis Armstrong, your Fats Domino, Dizzy Gillespie, jazz music. Everyone do jazz hands in a second. Woohoo! So Dakota, absolutely. Jazz is a big deal. There's a reason the 1920s are sometimes nicknamed the Jazz Age, right? Yeah, I really do like jazz. Yeah, I'm a French horn player, which is not a very jazzy musical instrument, but I do appreciate jazz as much as the next person, absolutely. My school has a fantastic jazz band, and man, they can really lay down some hot tracks, I tell you. A lot of fun. Thanks for laughing at me, Ella. I mean, with me. But yes, it is also a meme. But wasn't sure if you were referring to it or not. Either way, Harlem Renaissance, lots of new art, lots of new culture. And that's one important thing to be aware of. You don't have to memorize all of the people that are involved, but you certainly should have a couple up your sleeve to be able to talk about that. Remember, African Americans, in sort of a change in continuity over time, large topic, is frequently tested on APUSH exams and on tests. So Marcus Garvey, back to Africa stuff, that would be during the 1920s as well. You should be aware of some of those things. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So know some people from the Harlem Renaissance, why that's a big deal, and then we'll keep moving on. We kind of have the opposite now. 1920s culture also involves a whole bunch of racism, unfortunately. So we're going to see racism, we're going to see nativism. Remember, nativism is a fear of outsiders. It's kind of like xenophobia, but it refers to the fact that people like Native Americans, not Indians, but Americans who were here earlier. I mean, everyone in America is an immigrant, so this kind of doesn't make sense. But they don't like immigrants. So nativism is they don't like immigrants. And Mahfouz nailed it again. This is absolutely related to the Red Scare. We're going to talk about that. So first Red Scare. This happens in 1919. But in order to actually talk about this, you kind of need to go back a little bit to 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. Say that carefully. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, where communists take over Russia. They take over an entire country, and communists have been around for a while. You probably talked about them during the Gilded Age, but now that communists had taken over an entire country, there was a greater fear that they would be coming for the United States as well. And so in 1919, there was an anarchist who mailed some bombs to a bunch of people in the government, and Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer decided to arrest a whole bunch of people. That's known as the Palmer Raids. The second KKK comes out. I'll get to that in just a second. But the first Red Scare involves A. Mitchell Palmer and the United States government rounding up and arresting suspected radicals. These would be communists, socialists, anarchists, and obviously those three are very, very different. But the United States government did not see a difference between them at the time, and it was an era of paranoia, thus the Red Scare, and red equals communist. And it was kind of this era of fear. And so they would arrest people, deport people. One of the most famous to get deported is Emma Goldman, who was a labor activist. She got deported to Russia. You like communism so much? How about you go over there? Even though she wasn't Russian in terms of where she had spent most of her life. So the first Red Scare happens. You should be aware of that. A lot of cartoons related to that. And then we have the KKK. The second KKK. Remember, the first KKK was during Reconstruction. That was crushed by President Grant. The second KKK is now going to come back because of that racist film, The Birth of a Nation, that we already talked about. And fun little fact, not really a fun fact, but like interesting fact, the first KKK during Reconstruction never burned crosses on people's lawns. That was an invention of the filmmakers, actually, in The Birth of a Nation. And they thought it would look cool on screen. And so when the second KKK comes around after 1915, they decide to burn crosses on people's yards as a symbol because they saw it in the movie, which is a little bit weird. You also have some other examples of nativist sentiment, people being scared of immigrants. I mean, the KKK obviously doesn't like black people, Jewish people, Catholics, or immigrants, and sometimes those are all kind of connected. But you have the famous case of Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian anarchists who were convicted of murder and then sent to the electric chair. A lot of people thought that some of them were one of them was guilty, one of them wasn't. In fact, historians think that to this day. But they were sort of railroaded through the justice system and probably didn't get a very fair trial because of this nativist sentiment where everybody was scared and paranoid at the time. So be aware of some of those ideas and how there was a backlash to all of this immigration. We're going to see this at the national level through things like the Emergency Quota Act, that reduces the number of people that can come into the United States. This is the first time the United States sets a numerical limit on immigrants in its history. Obviously, there have been sort of racial laws before. Think of the 1790 Naturalization Act that says only white people can become citizens. But the Emergency Quota Act says 3% of the people currently living in the United States are allowed to come in every year. So, for example, if there are 100 Italians in the United States, 3 more Italians may come in every year. If there were 200 Italians, then 6 could come in every year. You can do the math. The emergency quota system, but it uses the U.S. Census in 1910, so it goes back a little bit. But that wasn't even enough. Nativists wanted to make the United States even more Anglo-Saxon. And so they passed the National Origins Act of 1924 that says not only are we going to move it from 3% to 2%, we're also going to move the date back to 1890, Move it back 20 years when the United States was even more white, and of course the definition of white changes over time. So I guess we could more accurately say when the United States was more Anglo-Saxon, more Northern European, more Scandinavian, Netherlands, English, rather than South and Eastern Europe like the new immigrants. And so it drops it down, and only 2% of those immigrants are allowed to come in. Two important caveats to mention, or just not really caveats, but just additional pieces of information about this. One is that there's no restriction on Western Hemisphere immigration, so we still have lots of Latinos coming in from Latin America because, much like today, they're useful in farm labor, and there's a lot of migratory work there. And then secondly, there is still no Asian immigration during this time period. Chinese exclusion still applies. The Japanese Gentleman's Agreement, the Asiatic Barred Zone, it just excludes all Asians during this time. So most of these laws are aimed at keeping the right kind of Europeans out, the wrong kind of Europeans out, and allowing the right kind of people to come in. So that continues on. And then, of course, we have Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement. Marcus Garvey was an African in the United States, and he went back and forth to Jamaica, I believe, and he wanted to move Americans away from the racism that was occurring all the time in the United States back to Africa, thinking Liberia or other places. So just be aware of his presence. He's sort of a black person's response to the racism and the nativism of this time period. One more slide, and then I'll pause for some questions because we've covered a lot so far. 1920s culture. We need to be aware that things are rapidly changing, right? So we have women's rights. The 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. This is the one that gives women the right to vote. There are flappers. An example would be that lady right there. Notice shorter skirts. You can see her ankles, le gasp. She has shorter hair, different fashion styles. This flapper young lady is going to be able to drink or wait. I thought there was prohibition going on. Yes, there was, but it was widely flouted. She might be drinking. She might be smoking. She might be having sex with who she wants. She might be making decisions about where she wants to work. She might be actually going to work as opposed to just getting married. She is a new modern woman of the 1920s. You should be aware of that. Then we also have a couple other controversies. One of them would be the Scopes monkey trial, depicted in the picture to the right, when it moved outside for a day. And this was sort of about fundamentalist Christianity against science, about whether or not humans came from apes and that whole evolution debate. But it was also a sort of microcosm, a small example of a larger problem. Again, we talked about the rural and urban divide in the United States. This is a very good example of that. So each side viewed the other as a terrible thing. So the New York City big coastal elites and their highfalutin science learning, and they're totally ignoring traditional religious morals, and they think they know so much, and they look down their noses at everybody else. Whereas then the people from the big cities would look down on these people from Dayton, Tennessee, and call them like backcountry yokels, hicks, religiously old, superstitious, out of touch with modern America and science. And you can kind of see where the tension continues to this day. The United States still has an enormous urban and rural divide. And then last but not least, we should mention the lost generation. These would be a bunch of writers who would write in the United States. Sometimes they go to Paris and they would write about how pointless life is after World War I. And so there's a lot of famous literature that comes out of the 1920s. Probably the most famous is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which is an interesting film starring Leo DiCaprio recently. Otherwise, you can watch the Robert Redford version from earlier. So 1920s, a lot of changes. Be aware that almost all of the changes are controversial. Prohibition is controversial, mostly because people don't pay attention to it. And there's speakeasies everywhere. Women's rights are controversial. Jazz is controversial. Dancing is controversial. Remember, one of the reasons that jazz is so controversial back then is because it was often produced by African Americans. It came out of the African American community, largely around New Orleans, blues kind of jazz stuff. And it was produced by African Americans, but white people loved it. And if there's one thing that drives old conservative folks crazy in the 1920s, it's the mixing of races. And that was super, super scary to them. And so jazz was not good. It was associated with interracial sex and drinking and smoking and dancing, and they didn't like any of those things. Yeah, Ella, the 1920s is definitely the controversial age. All sorts of problems. I want to pause here real quick. I have a question for you folks, but I want to know if you have one for me. We've covered a lot of ground so far. talking about 1920s technology, talking about 1920s culture. My question for you is this practice stimulus-based multiple choice question. Feel free to look at this one. But if you have a question, again, asking a question function down below. If it's a big, meaty question that you want me to address like at the end of the stream or right now. If you have a shorter, quick question, pop it into the chat. And you can, of course, answer this question in the chat as well. All right. So it looks like we have either C or B. The cartoon to the left exemplifies which of the following ideologies. So we need to know a couple of those kind of bigger words there. Randy BC, your nickname is perfect because we're looking like we're doing either B or C. Ooh, we seem to be pretty divided. Exemplifies, you notice that it looks like the word example, right? And then ideology looks like idea. This would be an ideology. And Dakota, exactly. Immigration is not an ideology. Absolutely. Plus, this cartoon is anti-immigration. If it was pro-immigration, then maybe, I suppose. But yeah, the answer is indeed C. This shows hatred of immigrants. Notice Europe is clamoring to get into the United States, and Uncle Sam is putting out the 3% gate. That means this is talking about the National Origins Act of 1924, by the way, and only allowing some to come in through this funnel, through immigration. This cartoon seems to be suggesting that this is a good thing. By the way, one technique, so yeah, it is C. Nice job. One technique for cartoons, if you're trying to figure out the point of view here, is to think, what would it look like if it was the opposite? So does this make it look like Uncle Sam wants more people to come? Does it make it look like it would be beneficial for more immigrants to come? Does it show the benefits of immigration? Does it show? No, it doesn't. So even though it's not very explicit that they don't like all these immigrants and it's kind of crowded, I guess, maybe that's an implicit way of saying there's too many. It's clearly not pro-immigration, and it doesn't look like Uncle Sam is stupid or dumb or mean or cruel or nasty for putting in those limits, the 3% gate that cuts down the immigration flow just a little bit. Next question. Ideas expressed in this cartoon are most similar to those expressed during which other time period? A little bit of a review here. They love to ask you these kind of questions on the AP exam, mostly because they have all of U.S. history to work with. So one way to think about this as you're reading through it, what other time period in American history saw a lot of controversy and maybe some nativism about immigration? The 1770s, the 1840s, the 1870s, the 1910s. Yeah, Mahfouz is like, time period questions, not fun. This is where knowing just a few dates is fairly helpful. I'm actually having my students take some date quizzes this semester because, I mean, no one likes just straight brute memorizing a whole bunch of dates. I get it. You don't have to know a whole bunch of these later. But you should be familiar with some of these dates so that way you can stay within the time period when you're doing short answer questions, or you can answer questions like this. So let's eliminate two that no one seems to be talking about. The 1770s, that's the time of the American Revolution. Think 1776, right? Not really a whole lot of controversy over immigrants at the time. The 1910s, some of that. Now, I see what your folks are talking about. Some people are saying the 1840s. Some people are saying the 1870s. The 1870s are before the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese Exclusion Act is 1882. Now, were there some controversies around should we kick out the Chinese during the 1870s? I would think so. But keep in mind, the really, really big controversy is that we've seen with nativist sentiment before is the Know-Nothing Party that emerges to oppose German and Irish immigrants in the 1840s. Some of you are like, oh man, it's been so long. We covered that in like October, Lagerway. Yeah, sorry. There's also the 49ers, gold mining, racism, absolutely. So if you answer, this is usually how AP questions are structured, right? There's two ones that you can just kind of eliminate right away, and then there's one that seems like it could be possible, and then there's a really good answer. If you answered the 1870s because you were thinking Chinese exclusion, you're not far off. You're doing just fine. 1840s is what we were thinking here because of the Know-Nothing Party and lots of nativism and racism toward immigrants that happens. One more.
Which of the following groups or people would most likely support the point of view portrayed in the cartoon? We kind of gave this already away a little bit because we talked about what the point of view of the cartoonist already is. So who else would be most likely to oppose? Yes, nice job. Who else would be most likely to oppose immigration? It's going to be D, the KKK. Keep in mind that they are anti-immigration. Flappers, it's irrelevant. They're just women's rights stuff. Supporters of Sacco and Vanzetti would probably be pro-immigration because they were immigrants. Harlem Renaissance poets might be concerned about immigration, but they might just be pro-minorities and anti-racism in general, but largely not really their topics. KKK definitely formed to be anti-immigration. Nice job there. You folks aced that one. All right, want to pause real quick. Make sure that you have a chance to ask questions. We're kind of done with the 1920s for now, except for foreign policy that we're going to cover at the very end. Do you have any burning questions that you've been longing to ask about the 1920s that I can help to answer now before we dive into the 1930s and the Great Depression? Giving you some time there. I don't want to waste our time, too, because, wow, it's ticking by already. So let me start talking about the Great Depression, but if you have questions, we can obviously go back and talk about that as we go. So Great Depression comes immediately out of the 1920s. In fact, it actually starts technically in the 1920s because of some of those problems we talked about earlier. So causes of the Great Depression, you should know a couple of these. Some of these are explicitly in the concept outline. You should be aware of credit, like we talked about earlier, people buying things they can't afford, and when you can't pay it back, there's a bit of a problem. So that's not good. Weak banks. If your banks are weak, then you're going to have problems. They're going to crash. That's not good. The Dust Bowl, there's an environmental catastrophe that happens out in the Midwestern states. That's not good. And then you also have the problem of overproduction. People are making, especially farmers, are just producing too much. And so we see all kinds of problems with farm prices going way down. They plant more to make the same amount of money. And the next thing you know, they have to plant even more to make more money because the prices keep going down. So weak banks, not regulated, Dust Bowl, environmental catastrophe made worse by taking up trees and native grasses. And then overproduction is also a problem for the causes of the Great Depression. Let's talk a little bit about some early responses to the Great Depression. First of all, bonus point for you folks, put it in the chat. Who was president when the Great Depression started? Who was president when the Great Migration started? In the 1920s, we had President Harding after World War I. Then we had President Coolidge. And Dakota got it. Yes, Herbert Hoover. President Herbert Hoover. He was a Republican. And although you can't say this about every single Republican at the time, he was a conservative Republican. Remember, they had conservative Democrats, conservative Republicans. It's not the same as today's parties. You just can't make those comparisons. But Herbert Hoover was a conservative Republican. And two fun stories / jokes about that. Hoover, like the vacuum cleaner, a lot of people thought that he sucked, like the vacuum cleaner. But 1920s joke. And back when I was a kid, I had some aunt and uncles who were pretty funny, or at least thought they were really funny. They got me a Herbert Hoover action figure doll. And what did he do? Nothing. He was just posable. So it's kind of a joke on Herbert Hoover, but it's not really true. Yeah, they thought it was hilarious. I was like, what am I going to do with this? I'm 12. But Herbert Hoover, it's not true that he did nothing. He did try to do some stuff. In fact, remember, as a conservative Republican, he would have been pretty laissez-faire in his approach to the United States economy. So when the Great Depression happens, because of the stock market crash and the bank failures, he's actually going to try to do something which goes against the conventional wisdom of the day. So there's the stock market crash, Black Tuesday, and that happens in 1929. Stocks go down. It's a little bit rocky for a while, but then the banks start to fail. And runs on the bank happen. This happens when you think your bank's about to fail, so you got to get your money out before the bank fails. Because if the bank fails and goes bankrupt and you haven't gotten your money out, you get nothing. If you're familiar with the classic film Mary Poppins, this is what happens when Jane and Michael try to get their money from their dad to buy food for the birds. They want their tuppence, and the dad won't give it to them, and someone overhears and says, "What? The bank won't give them their money? I want my money now!" And then it causes this huge panic,
and a run on the bank, which can be deadly to a bank. It's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. There's runs on the bank. Well, Herbert Hoover responds with some limited public works, some infrastructure projects. Remember, infrastructure, kind of like the anatomy of the whole country, either the bones or the blood. This would be things that carry goods from place to place. Your dams, roads, bridges, airports. These are things that not only provide some people with work, but also provide the economy with long-term stability and the ability to move goods all over the place. It's initially called the Boulder Dam. He's not an egotistical maniac who names it after himself. It gets named after him later. So he starts some infrastructure projects. He also raises tariffs, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. If you're familiar with Ferris Bueller's Day Off, this is the classic boring history teacher part where he says, they passed the anyone, Hawley-Smoot Tariff that did what to tariffs, raised or, and then he keeps going, right? So we're getting into some weeds here, but exactly. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff, it raises tariffs on goods coming in from other countries. It's a tax on imports, but the problem is every other country does that too, and the next thing you know, world trade grinds to a halt, and that's not very effective. Herbert Hoover tries to do a voluntary wage freeze. He tries to coordinate business leaders together. He wants people from private charities to give money, not the government to be giving money to people. He also tries to, Hawley-Smoot Tariff, and then he also tries to do some help for some people through non-direct relief by giving them jobs in a variety of areas, but doesn't really work too well, or at least it's not quite enough given the scope of what's going on. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates, which hurts the money supply, etc. Then in an election year in 1932, there's the Bonus March. And this is an event that you may or may not have heard of, and it may be a big deal. It's a good illustration of a lot of things. These are a bunch of World War I veterans who march on D.C. saying that they want their bonus money that was promised to them, sort of like combat hazard pay. It was promised to them in a few years. They wanted it now because they needed cash now. There was no J.G. Wentworth, and so they decided they needed cash now. So they went to D.C. and said, give us our bonus money now. We're suffering right now. We're veterans. Help us out. Exactly, Ella. 877 cash now. That's the JG. They're not even paying me for that. I'm not saying that again. But the Bonus March, they go to D.C. They ask for the money. Congress says no. And Herbert Hoover actually has them removed because they keep protesting in front of the White House and in front of the Capitol building. And it looks really bad in an election year. So he has them removed. Unfortunately, General MacArthur goes a bit crazy. And he ends up burning down some of their camps. It's a really bad event. You don't mess with veterans, right? Veterans are American heroes. And so Herbert Hoover kind of gets some of the blame. And therefore, it's one of the reasons why he loses that next election. So Herbert Hoover is initially president. Doesn't go so well for him. People don't like him. They call the shanty towns they live in Hoovervilles after him. In fact, you may have seen the classic example of when you hold out the side of your pockets to show how broke you are. They used to call those Hoover flags. To be like, hey, thanks, Hoover. We have no money. Yay. So, some hip practice real quick because we're running a little short on time and I want to make sure we can cover everything here. This is a song called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? I won't sing the whole thing for you, but it's a 1930 song, and notice it has 4 verses. And they used to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed the mob. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. This is all about how the ordinary working American was always there. He was fighting for the country, World War I. He was settling the West. He was building a dream. And now, they used to tell me I was building a dream with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line just waiting for bread? He's talking about, man, I did all these things for the country, and now I can't even get food. So this is a good example of somebody who's just feeling not so great about the Great Depression and feeling that they're kind of getting a little bit gypped by an ungrateful nation. Thanks, Randy. So even the Transcontinental Railroad is mentioned in the 3rd verse, right? The industrialization and urbanization of the Gilded Age is mentioned in verse 4. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Great song. Look it up. It's on YouTube. There's a variety of versions. They're good. Either way, you can see the historical context of this is talking about, thanks. The historical context is obviously the Great Depression, intended audience. He's talking to other people, potentially business owners, and the purpose and point of view is to say, look, I'm an American worker, just like you, and I deserve better than this. I helped to make this country. Can you spare a dime? Do you have any sympathy for me? People wrote lots of songs and poems about the Great Depression in an attempt to gain more sympathy, some empathy, but also to show solidarity with each other. If you were to use this in the context of a DBQ with an essay like this, evaluate the extent to which the Great Depression changed U.S. society from 1929 to 1940, you might say something like this. The high unemployment rate during the Depression led many to complain about a lack of hope and a lack of payoff for the hard work they put in to build the U.S. Doc 1. For example, some artists complained about a lack of appreciation for veterans who had fought for the U.S. in World War I, or for workers who had literally built the country's cities during the Gilded Age and who are now homeless or without work. Doc 1. So notice we kind of have the first part right there. This would be a usage point right there where you're kind of summarizing what it says. And then this part right here, more of a hip analysis where you're talking about the author's background. Just as an example, and I won't do any more singing for you. So let's move on. Who becomes president after Hoover because they think Hoover is incompetent and they don't think he's doing enough? Ella already had it. What's really nice about that is because he's known by an acronym, so you can type it in real quick. FDR, Franklin Delano, Pres for life, Roosevelt, as John Green says. FDR becomes president. He's the only president to have ever won more than 2 terms. He gets elected 4 times, although he dies in office very soon after he's inaugurated for the 4th time. He is president during 2 pivotal eras in American history, the Great Depression and World War II. That's a big deal. Yeah, Ella, good question. So there's actually an amendment that gets passed after Roosevelt, and it's sort of like a screw you Roosevelt thing, because somebody fact check me on this because I can't Google this during the stream, but I'm pretty sure that's the 23rd Amendment. Yeah, because 22nd, wait, 20th Amendment is lame duck, 21st repeals Prohibition. It'd be the 22nd Amendment, I think, that they pass in the late 1940s, 1950s, after FDR comes out of office, that says you may only serve 2 full terms, and if you take over for someone because they die and you're the vice president, okay, sweet, it was the 22nd, good. Then you may only serve a maximum of 10 years. You can serve 2 terms for somebody else, and they've been elected twice on your own. If you serve more than 2 terms for someone, that counts as your own term, and then you can only be elected 1 more time. Typically, it was 2 terms before FDR, just because that was the precedent that President Washington set. He served for 2 terms, and everyone was like, well, it was Washington. He was the first. He was the best. We better do what he did. And so they didn't want to do more than 2. FDR is president during a bunch of crises, and he thinks, the United States kind of needs this strong leadership that I'm providing. You shouldn't change horses in the middle of a river. And so he runs for a 3rd term. It's pretty controversial. Anyway, I digress a little bit, but fantastic. Yeah, he also said no political parties and no entangling foreign alliances. Yeah, we didn't listen to Washington too well. So the New Deal. FDR becomes president in 1933. And his programs that are helped by, obviously, Congress passes all the laws, but he proposes a bunch of new laws called the New Deal. There's 2 ways to look at the New Deal, one of which is to look at the early actions that he's talking about before. There's kind of the first and the second New Deal. There's also the 3 R's. We'll talk about those. And important to know that FDR is indeed a Democrat. So he's going to be different than Hoover. So some early actions that he takes, he declares a end to Prohibition, thus the We Want Beer signs, which is just a fantastic protest. An easy way to remember that is, at least in the United States, you can drink once you are 21 nowadays. So the 21st Amendment is the one that enables people to drink again. It ends Prohibition and all the organized crime that came with it and all the speakeasies and sketchy breaking the law during the 20s ends in 1933. He also proposes the Emergency Banking Act. He declares a bank holiday. He inspects the banks, makes sure that they're safe, and thus people have restored faith in the banks, and they're able to put more money in than taken out, and therefore we don't have the problem of the runs on the bank anymore. And then lastly, he starts a series of radio addresses directly to the people, known as fireside chats. He has a rather calming voice, and he sounded kind of like a grandfather, like a rich New England person that knew what they were doing. And so people began to trust him, and this was his way of directly addressing the people. Interesting parallels with like presidential Twitter accounts nowadays and press conferences and things like that. So fireside chats would definitely be an important part of the New Deal. Dakota asks, is the Agricultural Adjustment Act an early action or later on? It is an early action. We'll get there. I'm talking about like very, very early stuff, but without the alphabet soup programs for right now. That's actually going to be in a couple slides. Great question. So what is the New Deal? It involves some of that early stuff. Those are kind of just miscellaneous small topics you should be familiar with. But otherwise, they're the 3 R's. Does anyone know the 3 R's of the New Deal? If you do, write them in the chat. One way to talk about it, it's going to be a later bullet point because I put it later in the slide, is the first and the second New Deal. First New Deal is 1933 to 1935 or so, and the second New Deal is 1935 onward. So there's 2 different phases. The AAA is a part of that. Dakota says one of them is reform. Bingo. That's the last one. Good job. 2 other ones. It didn't seem like too many people were on this subject yet anyway, so it might be a preview for some of you. So no harm, no foul. 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. So relief says, hey, make sure people are not starving in the streets right now. So direct help. Give them relief from their suffering. Recovery says, let's restart the economy, put people back to work, give them jobs. You can see the picture right there of the WPA. And reform says, let's restructure the economy to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Let's put in place agencies for some regulation, for some preventing the 1920s and the runaway credit, et cetera, et cetera. And then we talked about the first and the second New Deal. That's another way to look at it. So let's give you some examples of some programs, and there's a lot of them. I only want to talk about a few of them, partly because we're running short on time and partly because you don't need to know all of these. You should have a couple in your back pocket. There's the AAA. We already talked about that just briefly, just because Dakota mentioned that one. That pays farmers to plow under more acreage. In other words, stop planting so that way crop prices can go up. Problem is it hurts a lot of sharecroppers, and it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States. So some of the New Deal is very controversial because it expands the federal government so much. We'll talk about that in a second. One to highlight, though, is the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It still exists to this day, and it makes sure that you have federal government insured deposits in your bank. So that way, if your bank goes bankrupt, you still get all of your money back. That's a big deal. It stops runs on the bank, and it stops bank bankruptcies, essentially, because you don't lose your deposited savings. Fantastic. I don't know if my little box of me on the video is covering this up, but FARA stands for Emergency Relief Administration, just in case you can't see that. A couple of other ones. I have 11 total that you can see here in the slides. FHA is important just because it's super racist and discriminatory against African Americans. And so the whole building of the middle class and suburbia and single family house program that occurs during the Gilded Age, Homeowners Loan Corporation, et cetera, doesn't apply to African Americans, and that's going to hurt them still to this day. A lot of reasons behind the huge racial wealth gap the United States has. A couple of other ones that you can be familiar with. PWA, very famous, builds a lot of infrastructure projects. And then a few more. Social Security, that's hugely important. You should definitely know Social Security. It's essentially a forced public pension system where you pay into it when you're working, and then you get money from it when you're old or disabled and you can't work anymore. And then lastly, the WPA or the Works Progress Administration builds infrastructure, but then also funds a lot of culture. This is where we get people going around and interviewing former slaves who are still alive, and you can listen to their interviews for free. This is amazing. So either way, you should choose a couple of those, regardless of which ones you think are the most important. You should be able to recognize some of these for sure, but be able to produce some of these on a short answer question. And then we'll actually show you a short answer question in just a second. The New Deal is very controversial because the liberals think, very, very liberal people think it doesn't go far enough. Conservatives think it goes way too far. So conservatives, including these old white guys on the Supreme Court, they think some of it goes too far, so they strike down some of it. Radicals like Huey P. Long, he's the share the wealth guy, think kind of like your Bernie Sanders, and less like horse shouting, I suppose, but very, very leftist, very liberal. And he thinks it doesn't go far enough. He wants to really take down the 1%, the billionaires and the millionaires, and redistribute and that kind of stuff. Shouldn't do that at the end of a live stream when I've been talking for an hour, right? So the liberals think it doesn't go far enough. Conservatives think it goes way too far, but it certainly does expand the role of the federal government. African Americans don't like it because it's discriminatory. It helps them a little bit in some sort. But yeah, in general, it's going to be fairly Jim Crowified because there's a bunch of conservative Democrats, not an oxymoron, they existed back then, conservative Democrats down south who wanted the New Deal passed only if it was segregated, and FDR had to work with them within his party. Dakota, would we call this an activist court? Perhaps. I probably wouldn't. Yeah, more the 60s. This is actually more of a conservative court saying, FDR, you're being an activist, a president. Activist kind of connotates changing a whole bunch of stuff, and so they would sort of be conservative. At least that would be my take on that. I'd more save the activist court for the 60s with the burger court for sure. Civil rights and all that. So a brief short answer question. We don't have a ton of time. Let me just throw it out there. Briefly describe one specific effect of the New Deal upon American society from 1933 to 1940. You could say the New Deal gave more people jobs. You're not wrong, but you'd want to expand on that a little bit, right? The New Deal created jobs through work programs like the WPA. We're getting better. By the way, a little bit of advice. If you ever write an acronym that you're not defining, you're probably doing it wrong. The first time you use the acronym, always define what it means. Say Works Progress Administration. So here would be a better answer. Again, not just because it's longer, but because it's more thought out. The New Deal created government-funded jobs on infrastructure projects through programs like the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. These temporary workers built things like roads and bridges, helping to reduce unemployment relief, while also building up the U.S.'s economic backbone for longer-term health recovery. It uses the 3 R's, or 2 of them anyway. It uses a specific program, and it talks about how it affects American society because it gives people jobs, which gives them hope, gives them income, something like that. You can maybe even add that to improve upon, something like that. So that would be one example of a question you should be able to answer. Ella mentioned homes. Absolutely. Talk about the Federal Housing Authority, the FHA. Okay, last topic for today is interwar foreign policy. That dashing man right there would be Warren G. Harding, and that is a British battleship there. We'll talk about why that is in just a second. So, interwar foreign policy, we're talking after the Treaty of Versailles, but before the United States gets involved in World War II. What does this look like? It's kind of this background. We talked a lot about the domestic home front. Now we need to talk about foreign policy. First, Warren G. Harding says, look, Americans don't really want to get involved in the world. We did this World War I thing, but that was kind of an aberration. It was an exception. We want to return to normalcy. So that's that famous phrase that comes with Warren G. Harding, a return to normalcy. That means usually American isolationism, or at least American non-involvement, because it's not like the United States doesn't get involved. You'll see in a second. But the United States certainly is not going to be active in doing a whole bunch of warfare. So some people have called it unilateralist or non-interventionist. So there's the Washington Naval Conference of 1921. The United States, along with Great Britain and France and Japan, tries to limit the size of navies. And so they agree on a 5-5-3 ratio of battleships and other large ships for the United States, Great Britain, and Japan. This is an effort to limit the arms race that occurred and partially caused World War I. It is successful until it's not. When Japan decides that it wants a bigger navy right before World War II, they leave the treaty, and the next thing you know, Hitler's making ships too. So trying to keep the peace. Similar with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact is supposed to make every nation agree not to use warfare as a means to solve their problems. Again, works well until the totalitarian states of World War II, namely your Japan, your Italy, and Nazi Germany, and even Soviet Union, decide not to use it anymore. So some of these treaties don't tend to be very useful in the long run. There's also the Dawes Plan, and this is confusing because there's also something we talked about maybe earlier in period 6 called the Dawes Act. and that was the Native American reservation divided up, take some of their land, put them on individual plots of land. The Dawes plan is a little bit different, and that involves the United States giving loans to Germany so Germany could pay off their reparations for World War I, and then that goes to Great Britain and France, who then owed a bunch of money to the United States for loans. And so it's this big triangle of money moving around. Works really well until the Great Depression hits, and then no one has any money, especially not the United States, and the whole thing collapses, and Europe goes into a depression as well, which leads to the rise of Adolf Hitler because he promises to make Germany a great power again, restore their economy, etc., etc. Speaking of that, the rise of Hitler. So, pardon me 1 second. Get a little stiff. World War II starts, depending on when you think about it, it either starts in the mid-1930s, like 1937, when Japan invades parts of China, or in 1939, traditionally the date for Europe, when Hitler invades Poland. Either way, World War II has definitely begun during the 1930s, and the United States is most definitely not involved. So what does the United States do? Well, initially, not a whole lot. The United States doesn't want to get involved in another world war. The last time was pretty awful. And so the United States Congress passes a whole bunch of things called Neutrality Acts. Those forbid the United States from trading arms with belligerents, aka people involved in fighting. And during those Neutrality Acts, FDR still wants to help out the Allies. He cuts off oil from Japan. He says, Japan, you can't just invade people and take it over. That's really not cool. So he cuts off oil and scrap metal from Japan. Japan goes, shoot, we need those. We're expanding for resources. We can't win a long war, but we can win a short war. And so they try to do that knockout punch that turns out to be Pearl Harbor. So you should be aware of the Neutrality Acts and how FDR tries to get around them, partially by embargoing Japan once they invade China. And then with the Nazis start taking over all of Europe. Before you know it, it happens really quickly in 1939 and 1940. And Great Britain is fighting against the Nazis by themselves. FDR, realizing that the Nazis are a threat to the United States too, tries to help out Great Britain, even though the Neutrality Act says that he really can't. And so he has to be very careful and tricky and conniving about this. And so he ends up doing things like cash carry, destroyers for bases, Lend-Lease. I suspect you'll cover those more in depth when you talk about World War II itself. But FDR tries to get around these and help out the people of Great Britain that he knows need help standing up to Hitler and his terrible Nazi fascism, which is not good. So the United States moves from largely isolationism, or at least not as involved during the 20s, to getting way more involved in the 30s. In fact, FDR even establishes the first peacetime draft in American history in 1940, the Selective Service Act, and we're getting people forced into the Army when we're not even at war yet, because we know war is coming. FDR is no dummy, and so the United States is getting closer and closer. Last thing is this cartoon. One of my favorite things to teach in U.S. history is this. Who made this cartoon? Can you see it in the lower left-hand corner? You can also tell from the art style, I suppose, too. This political cartoon is made by Dr. Seuss. Like, yeah, the Dr. Seuss that you're familiar with from, like, The Grinch Stole Christmas and Horton Hears a Who and Oh, the Places You'll Go and all those things. He drew political cartoons during World War II. This is so crazy. I love it. In this case, his perspective, if we were to sort of hip this thing, notice it's talking about the Neutrality Act. Well, the Neutrality Act is just going in circles. It's not actually that useful. It says it's all-out aid to our allies. We're doing all we can. We're 100% helping out. But are we really? All these supplies aren't really helping because the Neutrality Act prevents us from really going anywhere. So this is Dr. Seuss saying, we're not doing enough. Please help out England more. They need to stand up to Hitler. So I just thought I'd mention that. You can look up a whole bunch of ones. There's an entire book, maybe even a website called Dr. Seuss Goes to War, and you can see a lot of his cartoons, some of which are fairly racist against Japanese, but largely he's against the Nazis, very much against the Nazis. And it's fascinating to look at some of his cartoons as a way of exploring the United States' role before Pearl Harbor. Okay, whew. We just covered a lot of ground in an hour. We covered the entire 1920s and 30s, and we did some, well, let me just give you a quick recap while you think of questions or concerns or things that you want to mention to me. We talked about 1920s technology. We talked about 1920s culture and how there was racism, immigration, and controversies over a bunch of topics. We talked about the 1930s and how there was the Great Depression, as well as the New Deal. And then we talked about interwar foreign policy during the 20s and 30s and how that was largely trying to prevent war from happening again and not very involved in other countries until World War II started, and the United States kind of felt like it was forced to get involved a little bit. You folks have been fantastic. If you don't have any questions, I think we're pretty much good to go then. Remember to join us again on Thursdays at 9 p.m. for other ones. And I just want to encourage you folks, as you get more and more into second semester, as APUSH seems to be really overwhelming, keep a big view of it, keep a big picture, get enough sleep, eat enough food, make sure that you're taking care of yourselves, treat yourself. Self-love is important too. You folks got this. You're awesome. You're already on a 5-able stream. You're going above and beyond. You folks are fantastic. I hope you have a fantastic night and you have a fantastic rest of your week. We'll see you again soon for another 5-able stream. Thank you again. Have a great night. Oh, wait. Before I stop, Mahfouz had a question. Oh, man. Last minute. I was literally about to click it. Can I explain more on the Kellogg-Briand Pact? Yes, as a little bit of a PS here. So that was basically just an anti-war treaty that a bunch of powers would sign. The Washington Naval Powers Conference was to say, let's limit the size of navies. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was basically where all the countries got together and sort of League of Nations style said, hey, let's promise not to use war to solve our issues. And that lasted for a little bit. Not everybody did it, but certainly it was a worthy try, I guess, by the United States, who also didn't want to get involved or go to war again. So it works until it doesn't, much like the League of Nations, right? So once Germany and Italy and Japan want to expand, they just ignore it. And so the Kellogg-Briand Pact was noble, but it ends up ultimately failing. Thanks for a great question, Mahfouz. All right. I think that'll cover it. Again, have a great night, folks. Thanks for joining us.